attitude and perception between the states will indicate areas that Arizona has room for improvement towards passing a Death with Dignity Act, and these similarities will mark the areas where Arizona has already made progress on the next slide. This is the differences. So there are different perceptions between the two states about how important expected mental decline is for deciding on death with dignity, and Arizona said it was moderately important. Once again, purple. Oregon said it was very important. The next one is that patients' wishes are more important than families' wishes, and if they differ. Arizona said that this was slightly important, and Oregon said that this was very important. That's kind of a big difference. And the final factor that was significant is that hospice is a better option for the terminally ill than suicide is. In Arizona, this was very important, and in Oregon, it was moderately important. On the next chart, the two columns should be the same for each factor, so because there are similarities. The similarities between the two states are the life expectancy of the patient as a concern, and it's very important. The financial burdens of the family and the patient for medical care, and that's moderately important. The use of scarce medical resources to prolong life was not very important, and the death with dignity going against the religious values of the participant were not very important. So this also indicates that within the medical community, religion may be a factor in people's attitudes, but it will not influence their attitude according to their answer. It will not influence their attitude of the practice when dealing with the patient. This is different from the political community and the social community. So in Arizona, it's interesting that 100% of participants stated that they would vote to legalize physician-assisted suicide, but that 24% of that same number stated that they would never administer physician-assisted suicide. So this shows that there is respect for medical autonomy in Arizona because the participants would allow a patient the opportunity to pursue physician-assisted suicide, but there may be a personal value or an attitude that would prevent those same participants from helping that patient to pursue it. They just wouldn't want to be involved in the process. So the most influential perceptions of physician-assisted suicide in determining the attitude of it in a state, once again this is talking about the treatment isolated, are that hospice is a better option for the terminally ill. This just demonstrates a lot of trust and value in the hospice care system's ability to alleviate suffering rather than the patient needing death to alleviate their suffering, and that's it's a valid concern that needs to be addressed in future studies. And assisted suicide may be misused with disadvantaged persons. This is important because medical care is so expensive, and there's probably a concern that patients who are paying a lot of money for their medical care and whose family members are helping them with that payment outside of the insurance are that they would be a burden on their family. There's that concern, and so that leads into the concern that patients will be coerced into pursuing death with dignity when they do not actually want to die based on their values. And so along that same line of thought, one of the other large concerns was that it is a slippery slope that will lead to human euthanasia. So those are all anti-death with dignity for the most part when considering just the treatment option, but when the terminal illness factors were brought into the question, and meaning that when the participants were asked to consider the factors of the patient and their disease, the responses were a little bit more pro-patient. It said the important responses were how much pain and suffering a patient will experience and how much of that can be alleviated, and then the expected quality of life of the patient and the patient's right to autonomy with their medical choices. These all indicate more support towards allowing a patient to make a choice that may be physician-assisted suicide or it may be natural death, but either way, it was pro-patient choice and pro-patient wellness and anti-suffering. So the conclusion of all of this are that there are some hurdles to passing a Death with Dignity Act in Arizona. First, once again, because this was a big result, is that support for hospice care and trust in palliative care in Arizona is very high. We talked about it once again. There is trust that the medical support system for patients will be able to alleviate most of the pain and suffering that the patient will experience and will render a suicide unnecessary. And so there's also a fear that physician-assisted suicide will be misused with the disadvantaged populations. It's important to note that Arizona is a predominantly Republican state by by voter population and by representative population, and the Republican Party does not support physician-assisted suicide, so if people choose to vote along party lines, there will be no success for this treatment option in Arizona. There's also lack of funding for a campaign here, so that map that we looked at the beginning, there were campaigns going on all over the country, and Arizona is not one of those states. And so what a campaign does is it informs citizens of death with dignity and encourages citizens to help get it on a ballot measure for voting. And that would probably be helpful in Arizona, but it's not an option right now because there is not enough awareness, or any campaigns that are around have not been strong enough. And also the Health and Human Service Committee's involvement in whether or not Death with Dignity acts make it to voting in Congress are a hurdle, because as long as the Health and Human Service Committee opposes Death with Dignity, it's most likely that no attempts at legislation will be able to be voted on. So what does this all mean for us and for the terminally ill patients? In reality, all of us will experience death at some point, or we have experienced death in the form of a loved one or somebody that we know passing, and many people do experience terminal illness in some capacity, either peripherally or personally. And ultimately, it's important to consider that a bad death can overshadow a good life because of the extreme suffering and loss of personal autonomy and loss of individuality and ability that is associated with the dying process and the medical process leading up to that death. So we are trying to improve death here. We're trying to allow people the opportunity to have a good death, whether or not these treatments, because that will trickle down into the rest of the population. So Arizona has made progress towards the Death with Dignity Act. There are still hurdles that need to be overcome, and hopefully in the future more information can be distributed on those hurdles and we can work towards a Death with Dignity Act here. I would just like to thank my committee for their wonderful and extremely patient support with this very large project. It's Dr. Ryan, Dr. Piemonte, and Christine. I would also like to thank my Biology and Society committee for helping me craft this project in the early stages, and I would like to thank Dr. Bailon and Dr. Bayless for their extremely useful discussions on death with dignity and the death process. Do you have any questions?
I have questions. I have two questions. One, how big was your study sample?
So our study sample was 10 participants, and not all participants chose to answer all questions, and that is something that needs to be improved in a future study because there was lack of statistically significant evidence other than the ones that I presented to you, because not all participants were answering all of the questions. And so in the future, a larger sample will be needed and the methods will be improved to do that.
Cool. Actually, I don't have another question. I thought I did. I don't.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Wait, blinking. Okay. So for physician-assisted suicide, the difference between that and euthanasia is that they're administering the drugs to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then if a doctor, are there protections for doctors in Oregon that decide that they don't want to prescribe
You have to be registered through the health department in order to prescribe physician-assisted suicide in Oregon.
You have
So
to seek it out.
You have to choose to be registered for the most part, yes. And then they do preserve the right to deny a patient. If you actually look at the Oregon statistics on how many patients have applied for physician-assisted suicide compared to how many have received it, it's about like 1/3 to 1/2 don't receive the prescription. So that's partially because the patient was ineligible, and also partially because the physician just didn't participate in the treatment. So.
Can a patient choose to ask a different physician, or is that illegal if they don't get what they want?
So there's parameters around that in the states where it's legal. They would initially start with their attending physician or their primary caregiver, and then if that physician chooses not to do it, they would have to go through a treatment process with another physician, but that one physician isn't the only caregiver who is required for the prescription. You also have to have a consulting physician and a consulting psychologist, so there's a whole team of caregivers who come in and assess the patient and then agree on a prescription.
Okay. It's like a committee.
Yes.
Do you think if Arizona was able to get the funding for a campaign here, that would be influential enough upon the Health and Human Services Committee? Or do you think that would mostly be with the local population?
It would actually, so if a campaign were to happen here, I don't know if that would affect the legislative attempts in Congress, because those have been pretty consistent for the last decade plus. But if a campaign were to happen here, I think that it could be influential for creating a ballot proposition, which is where voters vote yes or no to death with dignity. And that's actually how Oregon and Washington and I believe Colorado and DC were passed. And Washington was passed directly as a result of campaign funds that were poured into Washington from Oregon in order to legalize death with dignity there. So it has been successful in the past.
Making me more curious. So all the states that you showed us are very liberal and blue states. Arizona is a red state, although we do have a lot of liberal influence or Democratic influence because of the colleges. But do you, in all honesty, see a state like Arizona, or I don't really know a lot of red states, Alaska, I don't know, actually passing Texas actually passing death with dignity?
I don't see it casually happening. It would have to be a serious effort. And then
how did it come about in Montana then?
Montana was actually it was a suing, and so the patient sued the Supreme Court in Montana for the right to die, and that patient won that case, but they have not created legislation. So it's on a case-by-case basis now, and there's a lot of gray zone there. So, but back to your question, it should be considered also though that Arizona has an aging population. We do have a lot of elderly citizens here, and those citizens actually, by and large, support death with dignity. So that Rocky Mountain Poll study that I cited earlier, the group under 35 years old supported death with dignity, I think 30% less than the group 65 and older. And so there is support here for it there. And then, like you said, we do have a slightly growing liberal population. And also, there was 56% support for it on that whole base level without party lines involved. So there is support. It's just a lot of effort needs to be poured into channeling that support in the right ways. So yes.
So when people talk about death with dignity, what happens? Is there a process for someone who's in a coma where the family decides to?
That would be an advanced directive, or if the person were to have a living will or do not resuscitate, that would have to be written before the person were to enter the coma. Otherwise, the laws around that are very different than death with dignity laws.
Okay.
And it's also, some of that is on a case-by-case basis, a hospital-by-hospital basis. There's a lot of gray zone in that area. So,
any more questions?
yes.
So I feel like one of the things you mentioned, you were talking about how religion was one of the factors, and do you think how would doctors be able to talk to families about that? Do you think that they would be able to discuss that issue and kind of overcome that hurdle? Because I feel like they could definitely overcome the hospice hurdle and some of the other ones. But I feel like that would be the hardest because it's very moral based for some people. Do you think they'd be able to?
I think they would. Also, it's not in this presentation, but I was lucky enough to have conversations with a lot of the participants after they filled out the survey, and a lot of participants did bring up religion as a value that needs to be discussed with patients, and because especially if a patient's religious values dictate that death has to happen a certain way in order for the afterlife to happen a certain way, they need to have that conversation with the patient, and that is respected. Typically, there's also a conversation that happens with the patient once it's determined that they are dying and that curative treatment isn't working, and that they have to shift their focus to supportive treatment. There's a conversation that usually happens, that's what would you like from your medical care, and what would you like for the remainder of your life, and how do we make that happen, and usually religion will come up in that conversation. There are also hospital chaplains that get involved in these conversations too. So. Any other questions? You guys are asking good questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, audience, for coming. And if we all please step outside, we're gonna have about